The lights inside the Situation Room were dim, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Phones were ringing. Advisors were whispering in urgent voices. Screens across the room showed maps of the Middle East glowing with red warning markers. Military commanders stood silently as intelligence reports continued to arrive. Something had shifted, something big enough that even the most seasoned officials could feel the gravity of it. Only hours earlier, the world believed the conflict was heading toward a brutal escalation. For days, the United States had been locked in a dangerous confrontation with Iran, a crisis that threatened to drag the entire region into chaos. Fighter jets had flown missions across the Gulf. Missile systems had been activated. Warships moved into strategic positions as global markets trembled with uncertainty. And at the center of this storm stood Donald Trump. He had taken a hard stance from the very beginning. Public statements were aggressive. Messages on social media were even sharper. The demand was clear and uncompromising. Iran must surrender completely. There would be no negotiations, no partial agreements, only total submission. The word spread quickly across international headlines, sending shockwaves through diplomatic circles. But wars rarely move in straight lines. Behind the scenes, the situation was becoming far more complicated than anyone had expected. Iran had refused to bend. Instead of collapsing under pressure, its leadership vowed resistance. Retaliatory attacks and threats began appearing across the region. Military analysts warned that the conflict could spiral into a much larger war, one that might involve multiple countries, global energy routes, and even nuclear tensions. The stakes were rising by the hour. Then came the phone call. It arrived quietly, without the spectacle of a press conference or the flash of television cameras. Yet inside government offices around the world, everyone immediately understood the importance of the moment. On the other end of the line was Vladimir Putin. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. According to officials familiar with the discussion, the two leaders spoke about the rapidly escalating war with Iran and the growing risk that the conflict could expand far beyond the Middle East. Moscow had its own concerns. Iran had long been an important partner for Russia, and the Kremlin feared that continued fighting could destabilize the region in unpredictable ways. During the call, Putin reportedly pushed for a political and diplomatic solution, warning that the war could lead to consequences far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. The message was clear. The conflict had reached a point where even global superpowers were beginning to worry about what might come next. Inside Washington, the effect of that conversation was immediate. Only days earlier, the tone from the White House had been uncompromising. The war would continue until Iran surrendered. Military operations were expected to last weeks, possibly longer. But after the call, something changed. Suddenly, the language coming from the administration began to soften. Instead of speaking about an extended campaign, Trump suggested that the conflict might already be nearing its conclusion. In a statement that surprised many observers, he declared that the war was very complete, pretty much, suggesting that Iran's military capabilities had already been severely weakened. For analysts watching closely, the shift was impossible to ignore. Just days earlier, the message had been one of relentless escalation. Now, the president appeared to be signaling something different, an exit ramp. The question was why. Some officials believed the answer was simple. The risks of continuing the war were becoming too high. The Middle East has long been one of the most volatile regions on Earth. A single conflict can ignite dozens of others. Proxy militias, regional rivalries, and global alliances create a web of tensions that can quickly spiral out of control. And this war had already begun to show signs of spreading. Shipping lanes were under threat. Oil prices were fluctuating wildly. Military bases across the region were on high alert. Every intelligence report seemed to carry the same warning: escalation could trigger a chain reaction. For Trump, the political stakes were enormous. When the conflict began, the administration framed it as a decisive strike that would quickly eliminate Iran's threat and restore stability. But if the war dragged on, or worse, expanded into a broader regional disaster, the consequences could be devastating. That is the brutal paradox of modern leadership. The same decision that looks powerful at the beginning of a crisis can become a burden if the situation refuses to stabilize. And this crisis showed no signs of calming down. Iranian leaders were refusing to surrender. Regional allies were urging caution. International organizations were calling for negotiations before the conflict reached a point of no return. Even within the United States, voices were growing louder. Some lawmakers demanded stronger military action. Others warned that the country was being pulled into another endless Middle Eastern war, something Americans had spent decades trying to escape. Trump now stood at the center of a geopolitical crossroads. On one side was escalation, more strikes, more military pressure, and the possibility of forcing Iran to its knees. On the other side was de-escalation, diplomacy, negotiations, and the chance to end the conflict before it consumed the entire region. Neither path was easy. Escalation risked global chaos. Diplomacy risked political backlash. And so the world began watching for every signal, every statement, every subtle change in tone coming from Washington. Because in international politics, sometimes the smallest shift in language can reveal the biggest shift in strategy. Trump's comments about the war being nearly complete sparked intense debate among analysts. Some believed he was declaring victory before negotiations could begin. Others suspected something more strategic, that the administration was preparing to pivot from war toward diplomacy. Either way, the timing was impossible to ignore. The statement came just after the conversation with Putin, and that raised an even larger question. What exactly had been said during that call? Diplomatic conversations between world leaders rarely become public in full detail, but history shows that such calls can alter the course of conflicts in dramatic ways. A single warning, a single piece of intelligence, a single proposal for mediation. Any of these could change the calculations inside the White House. Russia, after all, was not just another observer in the conflict. Moscow maintained relationships with multiple actors across the Middle East. It had channels of communication with Iran, with regional governments, and with global diplomatic networks. If Putin was signaling that the war could trigger something even more dangerous, something that threatened global stability, Washington would have had to listen. Because great power politics is rarely about pride alone. It is about survival. In the days following the call, the atmosphere around the conflict began to shift. Diplomats quietly resumed back-channel discussions. International mediators began exploring possible pathways toward de-escalation. The rhetoric remained fiery, but the strategy behind the scenes appeared to be evolving. For Trump, the challenge was maintaining strength while avoiding catastrophe. He could not appear weak, but he also could not ignore the reality that prolonged war carries unpredictable consequences. Every leader who has entered the White House eventually faces that same test. The world expects certainty. History delivers chaos. And in moments like these, decisions made in a single phone call can echo across decades. Some supporters argued that Trump's strategy had worked exactly as intended. By applying overwhelming pressure, the administration had forced Iran into a defensive position and created the conditions for ending the conflict quickly. Critics saw the situation differently. They believed the war had been launched without a clear plan for what would happen afterward, and that the sudden shift in messaging revealed how complicated the situation had become. Both interpretations may hold pieces of the truth, because geopolitics is rarely as simple as victory or defeat. It is a constant struggle between pressure and compromise, between strength and restraint. And at the center of this struggle are human decisions, imperfect, uncertain, and made under enormous pressure. As the world watched the unfolding crisis, one thing became increasingly clear. The conflict that began with demands for unconditional surrender was now moving into a new phase, one shaped not only by missiles and military strategy, but by diplomacy, global power dynamics, and the quiet influence of a single conversation between two of the world's most powerful leaders. History may eventually reveal exactly what was said during that call. But even without knowing every word, the consequences were already visible. The tone had changed. The war had slowed. And the world was once again reminded that sometimes the most dramatic turning points in global history do not happen on battlefields. They happen during a single phone call, when two leaders speak, and the course of events suddenly begins to move in an entirely different direction.